It has been said, mostly by people within university English departments, that to study literature is to study history. And while I would argue that that's about as true as saying that to go bowling is to get to third base, there's a sliver of truth in the statement. Studying literature means viewing the past through, albeit a very specific lens. And the more rigorous the study, the wider that lens can become. Because the canon of literature is structured in terms of time and movement, the more you study it, the more your interest naturally becomes inclined towards the periods of history and literary movements you find the most interesting. Over time, that fondness develops into a profound love, and for me, that period was the late 19th and early 20th century, when all art movements began responding to the Industrial Revolution. The world was becoming mechanized, more efficient. The entire landscape of civilization was being radically restructured. And in the arts, that meant challenging how everything had been done for centuries. Now, to be clear, I don't look at barely comprehensible scribblings and think they're superior to the oil masters of old, or that Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot aren't convoluted nonsense. But it is this conflict, this artistic war between old and new, that captivates me. Just as an example, following World War I, there were soldier poets expressing the grief and trauma of losing so much in a pointless war by writing poetry about the absurdity of it all. Much of these poems were still in the metered verse that had been the standard for centuries. Meanwhile, poets from the intellectual class, basking in the very safety those soldiers provided, decried the style they used in order to decry the same war. Now, if you've read my comics, you already know the effect this had in my writing. But at this exact same moment in history, right here in America, something completely separate but just as fascinating was brewing. And the effect it would have on our nation's culture is something that can never be overstated. That is the subject of today's video, and one of the things I absolutely love: the Harlem Renaissance. Following the American Civil War, the South was a mess. Between the fallout from the Bitter War and the sudden emancipation of slaves, there aren't enough words to describe the volatility simmering. In 1967, the United States military came to effectively occupy the South in order to maintain the closest approximation to peace in what's called the Reconstruction Era. But after 10 years, the occupation had become widely unpopular, and the Democrats controlling the southern states managed to end it. Following the military occupation, the Jim Crow era began, and coupled with a continually declining economy, the American South had become a vastly unsafe and undesirable place for many black Americans to continue living. So they left and headed for the bustling metropolitan cities up north. Now, just as a sidebar, I know the reputation the South had and has. It's a bad, terrible place filled with mean, evil racists. They had slavery and the North didn't, because the North are the enlightened people who are morally superior and speak correctly. I mean, Frederick Douglass escaped slavery in Maryland, came to New York, and he was free. Everyone there was nice and liberal, and nobody held a racist thought in their enlightened Yankee brains. Only that's all nonsense. People in the North were just as prone to bigotry and hatred as anywhere. History is just kinder to them by way of comparison. I'll go into more detail later, but just know that if you use history to look down on people from the South, you probably shouldn't. You're no angel by the exact same metrics. Civilizations are in part defined by the art they produce. It is ingrained in the cultural identity, and there are some civilizations for which the majority of what we know comes from the stories they told. As Americans, our identity is defined by things like independence, individualism, and exploration of and a profound relationship with nature and the unknown. This is seen in writers such as Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and, at least I would argue, Frost and even Cormac McCarthy. The emancipation of black Americans and their relocation to the sprawling metropolises afforded them the opportunity to come together and craft their own artistic movement, one which would forever shape American culture. This is the Harlem Renaissance. The extent of the movement spans numerous mediums, from prose and poetry to music, art, stage drama, and film, with each one speaking to and informing one another in countless ways. Now, as a student of literature, I am not even remotely qualified to talk about most of these. But since this is a video about my favorite things, I just wanted to take you on a brief tour through the movement by telling you about my 3 favorite writers. So, come on, let's go. I'm going to tell you the story of a poem. a poem that made its way around the world before its author could strap on his boots. There are tales of it being told all across the globe, from officers reading it to soldiers on the battlefield, to the floor of the U.S. Congress, the British House of Commons, the Russian Revolution, and everywhere in between. If we must die, let it be not like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. If you want to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, there's hardly a better place to start than the man most often credited with kicking the whole thing off, Claude Mckay. His poem, If We Must Die, became a seminal work all across the world, with many people not knowing what it was even about. Mckay, born in Jamaica in 1889, came to America in 1912, living in New York and working odd jobs for several years, including as a waiter on a train. Remember how I said before that I go into more detail about the North being just as racist as the South? Well, pay attention, because that train is literally pulling into the station. So one night, Mckay is working and his train has a stop in Chicago. He and some co-workers have some time to kill, so they get off to take a walk and enjoy the night air. It's a lovely evening, right up until they are confronted by a frothing, angry mob. This certainly wasn't uncommon for Chicago and several cities in the supposedly tolerant North, and though a group of soldiers intervene and they escape the encounter unharmed, Mckay and company are lucky to not have been among the dozens of blacks lynched by white mobs in the city of Chicago that summer. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die. Mckay was just a fascinating guy because no matter what he was doing, there were two things to be certain. Firstly, it wasn't going to be popular when he did them, and secondly, they would later become popular and he would receive no credit for being ahead of the curve. Okay, quick sidebar. You know how even today loads of people are genuinely surprised that black Americans don't all think exactly the same? Like they're actually shocked that blacks aren't a monolith that agrees with each other about everything. That they're complex beings with a vast array of ideas, beliefs, and opinions. Well, it turns out it's always been this way, and I don't just mean Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I mean always. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the single most prominent and important intellectuals and theorists in black history, American history, and history period. He co-founded the NAACP, founded, edited, and wrote The Crisis. He wrote theories including double consciousness, which has been pored over and studied for more than a century. He is one of, if not the most significant African American intellectuals, and he is not a very big fan of our friend Claude Mckay. See, Du Bois had ideas about what black American arts should be. He posited that they should strive to be just as legitimate as white arts. But some disagreed, believing that the art produced by blacks shouldn't be compared to whites at all, that it should be its own thing, and any comparison would contradict the struggle for freedom and independence. So how did Claude Mckay fall into this equation? Well, after Mckay established himself as an accomplished poet, he began writing novels. Home to Harlem, published in 1928, reads like a love letter to the culture and nightlife of Harlem, as viewed through the experiences of lower-class, thrill-seeking vagabonds, with all of their debauchery and flaws on full display. Banjo, published the following year, was similar but was set in the ports of Versailles, France, following the escapades of a group of part-time workers, part-time musicians, and full-time good-time seekers. While Home to Harlem depicted the racism experienced by black Americans in New York, Banjo contains some pointed jabs at the French, who love nothing more than to look down on Americans and claiming to be above racism, while also refusing to hire or associate with any blacks they encounter. But for Du Bois, Mckay's writing was marred to the point of being downright damaging to the black community, due to his characters being lecherous, depraved, promiscuous drunkards. Quote, "After the dirtiest parts of its filth, I feel distinctly like taking a bath," wrote Du Bois. He also stated that Mckay's writing reads like a pamphlet distributed by the KKK, confirming every stereotype whites held about black people. In response, Mckay argued that he was only interested in showcasing the reality of blacks' lives, complete with both beauty and scars, while Du Bois was only interested in what was advantageous to himself and what Mckay often labeled the black intelligentsia. Writing to Du Bois, he said, "I sympathize and even pity you for not understanding my motive, because you have been forced from a normal career to enter a special field of racial propaganda. Therefore, I should not be surprised when you mistake the art of life for nonsense and try to pass off propaganda as life in art." Throughout his life, Mckay ran afoul of conventional thinking. He was an early supporter of socialism, though not when it was fashionable. This earned him a thorough investigation by the US government and very nearly exile. But after spending some time in Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution, he returned to the US and later denounced socialism. But by then, socialism had become popular among black intellectual circles, meaning once again Mckay would be an outsider. Alienated from the very movement he helped to found, Mckay left Harlem and later rediscovered Catholicism, writing extensively about its beauty before passing away in 1948. Mckay is one of my favorite writers, and I heartily recommend Constab Ballads and Harlem Shadows for his beautiful verse poetry, as well as Home to Harlem and Banjo for his prose. His early craftsmanship and poetic composition set him up to be an artful prose writer, enabling him to pen the sometimes mundane activities of people leisurely lounging on a dock to read like escapades. And his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, makes for fascinating insights into a fascinating life. I'm embarrassed to admit that I haven't read as much of this next author as I'd like to, but I plan to make amends in the near future. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Alabama in 1891 and came to America in 1925 to attend Columbia University. During this time, Hurston was doing two things. Firstly, she was writing and publishing poetry, short stories, plays, and essays. She teamed up with other young Harlem writers, including Langston Hughes, another legend, to form I can't tell you what they called themselves here, but they began publishing Fire, the second most important Harlem Renaissance publication, behind Du Bois' The Crisis. Oh, and the other thing she was doing? Oh, just an astronomical amount of work studying the folklore, languages, colloquialisms, and anthropology of rural black communities. She was just a straight-up anthropologist. Not just in the US either. She went to Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, and chronicled an unbelievable amount of knowledge about folk stories, religions, and cultural practices. In 1937, her second and most well-known book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was published. In it, you can see on every page all of the work she did studying and chronicling rural communities. The book is a relatively short first-person account of the life of a woman in rural Alabama, starting from her adolescence when her grandmother gave her away to be married, to her adventures and struggles in Florida. It is one of the most beautifully composed pieces of literature I've ever read. The dialogue and descriptions pour off the page, and it's the kind of book that you find yourself just consuming much faster than you even realize. Like Mckay, Hurston's novel drew serious criticism from, I guess we'll stick with Mckay's term, the black intelligentsia, and for many of the same reasons. The novel is written in dialect, consistent with the book's setting, working-class characters, Hurston's own upbringing, and her extensive studies of rural communities. This upset some of the cosmopolitan metropolitans, such as Richard Wright, who likened the behaviors and colloquial language in the novel to that of minstrel shows, in which mostly white actors performed racist caricatures of blacks. Wright said, quote, "Her novel is not addressed to the Negro, but to a white audience whose chauvinistic tastes she knows how to satisfy. She exploits that phase of Negro life which is quaint." But remember, he's describing the writing of someone who isn't just black and from the very setting the book takes place in, but someone who has devoted much of her life to studying these areas and precisely how the people there speak and act. The book also received criticism for its sexual depictions, with fellow author Ralph Ellison calling the book a blight of calculated burlesque. What's strange, however, is that although there are occasional descriptions of the main character's maturation into womanhood, and later having sex with her husband, it is always wrapped in Hurston's gift for allusion, image, and metaphor. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom, and the thousand sister calyxes arch toe meet the love embrace. Scandalous. What's stranger, and something Hurston herself pointed out, is that the reviewers calling her writing a piece of smut did not feel the same when it was men doing much worse with the pen. Explicit violence, rape, sex, and even the murdering of prostitutes, all made for quality reading, according to those same reviewers, and in some cases was found in their own work. But a woman writing tastefully about a woman's experiences somehow crossed the line. I'd mentioned before that socialism became fashionable in black intellectual circles, ultimately making pariahs of those who disagreed. Unfortunately, Hurston met a similar fate. As a conservative, her opposition to the promises of communism made her an outcast of the movement. She would ultimately leave New York and return to the South where she grew up. And while her contemporaries had their final resting places honored with memorials across New York, Zora Neale Hurston quietly passed away in Alabama in 1960 and was buried in an unmarked grave. But take solace, dear viewer, as the beauty of Hurston's writing would later be rediscovered by the next generation. Her work cherished for what it deserved, and her final resting place found and memorialized by fellow author Alice Walker. A small but well-deserved victory for a very talented and dedicated woman. I promise I didn't plan this when I narrowed my list down to 3. Maybe I'm a contrarian, or maybe I just like troublemakers, but here we go. George Skyler was he was an ardent socialist, so maybe he won't make whoops, he's denouncing socialism, saying it's propped up by frauds who don't actually care about black people. Some things never change. Skyler cut his teeth as a journalist and editorial writer, first independently for various publications and then exclusively for the Pittsburgh Courier. His first editor, the acclaimed H.L. Mencken, praised his style, saying he is one of the most competent editorial writers now in practice. Now, I said I like troublemakers, so let's get into it. Because if you like hot takes, George Skyler is your guy. On the notion of there being a distinctly black arts, Skyler said that this was impossible due to centuries of white influence and that, quote, the Afro-American is merely a lamp-blacked Anglo-Saxon. This was part of an article published in Du Bois' Crisis, and something that Langston Hughes acclaimed the Negro Artist and Racial Mountain was a direct response to. When Dr. Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, Skyler wrote, Dr. King's principal contribution to world peace has been to roam the country like some sable typhoid Mary, infecting the mentally disturbed with perversions of Christian doctrine and grabbing fat lecture fees from the shallow-pated. That same year, Skyler came out against the Civil Rights Act, saying that while racism was horrific and ugly, he opposed any federal action designed to coerce public attitudes. George Skyler was like if Stephen A. Smith and Candace Owens had a time-traveling child. But this is nowhere near the reason why I included him. Hell, I don't agree with much of what he said. I included George Skyler because he wrote the funniest book I've ever read. Black No More, being an account of the strange, wonderful workings of science in the land of the free AD 1933 to 1940, is a novel that is a little bit science fiction, a little bit futurism, and a whole lot of masterfully crafted satire about race in America. In the book, a scientist named Dr. Junius Crookman announces that he is going to end racism permanently with his new invention, a medical procedure called Black No More that turns black people into whites. The first black man to undergo the treatment, Max Fisher, is a shifty character who mostly wants an easier life and to bed Southern white women. But undergoing the treatment, he finds that life isn't just automatically easy now that he's white. And he ends up joining and rising through the ranks of the Knights of Nordic, a white supremacist organization. Now, as the procedure becomes more popular, the white supremacists face a crisis. Because if everyone becomes white, what will be the purpose of their organization? How can their belief system, predicated in superiority, continue without an easily identifiable group to look down on? But here's the twist and what I think makes this book a particular brand of genius. On the other side are the black intellectuals. Here we have Dr. Shakespeare Agamemnon Beard, whose publication, The Dilemma, denounces the treatment. He and his circle of black activists also oppose Black No More, because if racism disappears, what will they do? The business of fighting against racism has been very lucrative for them, and without it, why, they would have to go out and get actual jobs. Okay, now that is a quick summary of just the premise of the book. I won't spoil the rest, just go find this immediately because it is ridiculously funny. It is truly a perfect piece of satire, partly because Skyler spends so much time highlighting the absurdity of race and ruthlessly roasting both sides, black and white. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is probably the only book that actually had me in tears from laughter. Skyler was like the final boss of outcasts, but see if you can recognize the pattern here. In 1947, Skyler published The Communist Conspiracy Against the Negroes. 30 years later, and just before his death, the last person to interview Skyler, fellow writer and satirist Ishmael Reed, stated it was common knowledge in black intellectual circles that it was considered taboo to interview, write about, or even speak of George Skyler. When asked in that final interview if he recalled an incident of a communist radical paying him a visit at his home, Skyler stated that he did not recall because it happened so frequently that he always wrote with a pistol next to his typewriter. So that is the end of our tour. 3 writers who still managed to ruffle feathers within a movement predicated on ruffling feathers. But this is by no means comprehensive, and there's still plenty of undiscovered gems within this period and this movement. And for the sake of clarity, many of the people I described who opposed the writers I selected were fantastic writers in their own right. Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, all incredible, immensely talented, and worth exploring. W.E.B. Du Bois is as well. A few years ago, I was in Chicago and visited the Museum of African American History, where I was able to see some original issues of the crisis and read through the scans. That's what I love about the Harlem Renaissance. Not just the diversity found in the art, but the diversity of opinions, viewpoints, and beliefs that informed its creation. The history of African Americans is unlike anything else in human history, and the burgeoning of their art, the moment that they broke ground and crafted something for themselves, is something that I don't think, at least artistically, can ever be replicated. It is more than worth your time and effort to explore and find some of the things that move you the way they have moved me.